Borodar Baub, good morning everyone. I hope you're keeping safe, sane and smiling, sane-ish. You may have seen I slightly lost it midweek with the facial hair issues, but I hope you're well. I've got a couple of treats for you today. We've got a reading in a second from one of our global gang, followed by a sermon from our wonderful own Ray Vincent. So two things to look forward to, but first a reading from the Old Testament. It's taken from Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 to 10a. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre, while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Abraham looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he hurried from the entrance of his tent to meet them and bowed low to the ground. He said, "If I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat, so you can be refreshed, and then you can go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." "Very well," they answered. "Do as you say." So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah. "Quick," he said, "get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd and selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant who hurried to prepare it. He then brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree. "Where is your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There, in the tent," he said. Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son."
Good morning. Happy to see you all this morning. At least I can't see you, but you can see me. Greetings here from Peter DeYoung at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church here in Beechwood, Ontario. I've taken the opportunity to come down to the church, even though we're closed, to take the opportunity and read the scripture this morning. So greetings to everyone there. Our hearts go out to all in St. David's and in Pontypridd, especially in this time of COVID. Today I'm going to be reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 13 to 35. The word of the Lord. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going up to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all the things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who is the prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him to be crucified. And when we had hoped that he was the one to redeem all of Israel. Yes, and besides this, it is now the 3rd day since these things have taken place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive." Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found just as the woman had said, but they did not see him. Then he said to them, "Oh, you fool, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all of the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer all these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all of the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village in which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while we were talking to us on the road, while we were opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem. And as they found the 11 and their companions gathered together, they were saying, "The Lord is risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how they had made known to them the breaking of the bread. This is the word of the Lord. Amen.
One of the things I love about the Bible is that it has lots of mysteries in it and lots of puzzles. Some people think this is a problem. They say, how can it be the word of God if it contradicts itself? Or what message can I get from it if I don't understand it? But to me, this is the glory of the Bible. It's the voice of many different people telling their stories and talking about their experience of God. We have to listen to all the voices, wonder what's behind them, and think for ourselves. The puzzles and the mysteries are fascinating. Take this story, for instance. There are 4 Gospels, each telling the story of Jesus: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Why is this story only in Luke? If it wasn't for Luke, we would never have heard of a place called Emmaus, and would never have heard of a man called Cleopas. And why, when there were 2 people in the story walking together, is only one of them named? And why is the name given rather casually? Most storytellers would introduce the characters at the beginning, but Luke starts off with saying 2 of them were walking along the road, and only after a stranger asks them what they were doing does he say that one of them, who was called Cleopas, answered the question. They were obviously part of the circle of disciples. They had heard the news of the women finding the empty tomb. They knew where to go back to Jerusalem and where to find the place where the apostles would be gathered. How come then that we've not heard of any disciple called Cleopas other than here? And who was the other one? It seems they lived in the same house in Emmaus. So what were they? Husband and wife? 2 men sharing a home? 2 brothers? A brother and sister? A father and child? A master and his servant? Could be anything. Luke, among all the Gospels, stresses the inclusiveness of Jesus. So it wouldn't be like him to deliberately not mention a wife or a servant. The best guess I can give is that when he first heard the story, he wasn't given the names. And later he found out that one of them was called Cleopas, so he thought it was worth mentioning. This is just one of the mysteries in this mysterious story. The other one, of course, is how could they walk and talk with Jesus for so long and not recognize his face or his voice? Again, people have attempted various answers, some of them possible but not likely. Maybe because it was getting dark. Maybe his face had altered a lot because of his suffering. Maybe they were so distressed that they didn't really look at him. Or probably because they didn't believe he had risen, so they couldn't believe it was him. It looked a bit like him and sounded a bit like him, but they assumed it was somebody else. Or maybe, and I'm being really unorthodox now, it wasn't him at all. It was a stranger. But looking back afterwards, they realized that they'd had an encounter with the risen Christ. But the story tells it quite plainly. It tells it as a supernatural appearance. Their eyes were kept from recognizing him. This seems to imply that the risen Christ had the power to decide when people could see him and when they couldn't. There's another small puzzle as well. When they sat down for a meal, well, it's usual in Jewish custom and in most customs, it's usual for the host to give thanks and break the bread. But here, the guest took over. Another thing about this story that's often not often noticed is that it's not a very sweet and gentle one. In our church, we tend to assume the Emmaus. We tend to uh, associate the Emmaus walk with what we usually do on Easter Sunday evening, just a quiet, pleasant walk, and then a service afterwards, the Lord's Supper. But the story isn't quite like that. Most of the translations soften the language a bit, but commentaries point out that in the original Greek the language is quite strong. The two were not just talking, they were having a rather agitated discussion. It could be translated arguing or debating with each other as they walked along. And when it says their eyes were kept from recognizing him, the word, as it's rendered in the Authorized Version, is holden, suggesting they were forced shut by a superior power. And they stood looking sad, but then the word sad is a word that could also mean angry. So maybe a better translation would be bitter. And when the stranger asks what they're talking about, Cleopas answers the question rather rudely. Are you the only person in Jerusalem not to know these things? It's a bit like the expression we might use today, what planet have you been on? And the way he tells the story is definitely negative and rather dismissive of the women. These two people seem determined not to believe, and perhaps they rather resent the intrusion of Jesus. But having heard their story, Jesus says then, according to the Authorized Version, which is very blunt, O fools! O fools and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. This isn't a gentle reassurance. He implies that if they weren't so stupid and so slow, they would have seen the meaning of it all. And then he goes through the scriptures, pointing out all the ways in which the death and resurrection had to be. They were part of the plan. And this, of course, is what the early church was always doing. This was one of its main jobs, drawing on the scriptures to prove to unbelieving Jews and to others that Jesus really was the Messiah. At the time when Luke wrote his gospel, some decades after the time of Jesus, it would have been a long time since anybody had actually seen Jesus alive. And perhaps he's telling this story to suggest that the living Jesus can come to us in unexpected ways, perhaps even through a stranger we meet on the road. The Christian faith is supposed to be one of hope and joy, but real life sometimes makes it hard for us to believe and to feel the joy. Tragic and devastating things happen to us, and we're thinking especially at this time of all those people who are suffering and being bereaved by the coronavirus. We sometimes need help to see that somehow through it all a greater purpose is being worked out. We can't understand the ways of God. We can only somehow grapple with them in faith. I'm sure you will have heard of Václav Havel. He was the Czech writer who struggled bravely against the communist regime in Czechoslovakia and then became its president. He was a Christian believer, and talking about hope, he said, hope is definitely not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense regardless of how it turns out. And I think that very well defines Christian hope. And how did these two disciples find belief and hope? Only when they invited the stranger into their home. And even here the language is quite strong. They didn't just casually ask him if he'd like to stay the night. He was going on. He was determined to go further on. And they, in the Authorized Version, constrained him. In other versions, they insisted on him coming in. It's like the story we read from Genesis of how God came to Abraham in the form of three strangers, and how Abraham jumped up to welcome them. He offered them some water to wash their feet and a bit of bread. But what he actually gave them was freshly made cakes, a calf specially slaughtered for the occasion, and a delicious creamy dressing. And having given them that meal, Abraham and Sarah received the message from God that Sarah was going to have the child that she had longed for. Hospitality. Well, that's unfortunately of hospitality of the usual kind, at least, is something that we are not able to practice at present. But there's more than one kind of hospitality. We can open ourselves up to other people, to different ideas, different people, different experiences. Rather than turning away from them or thinking they've got nothing new to teach us, we can invite them in. And then we may find that the living Jesus is with us in a new and unexpected way.